Good morning. I'm today leaving the Conservative Party and joining UKIP. This hasn't been an easy decision. I've been a member of the Conservative Party for all my adult life. It's full of wonderful people who want the best for Britain. My local Conservative association in Clacton is thriving. It brims with those that I'm honoured to call my friends. The problem is that many of those at the top of the Conservative Party are simply not on our side. They aren't serious about the change that Britain so desperately needs. Of course, they talk the talk before elections. They say what they feel they must say to get our support when they want our support. But on so many issues, on modernising our politics, on the recall of MPs, on controlling our borders, on less government, on bank reform, on cutting public debt, on an EU referendum, they never actually make it happen. All three of the older parties seem the same. They've got swathes of safe seats. They're run by those who became MPs by working in the offices of MPs. They use pollsters to tell us what to tell the voters. Politics to them is about politicians like them. It's a game. It's a game of spin, positioning. First under Tony Blair, then Gordon Brown, now David Cameron. It's all about the priorities of whichever tiny clique happens to be sitting on the sofa in Downing Street. Different cliques, same sofa. Few are animated by principle or by passion. Those that are soon get shuffled out the way. Many are just in it for themselves. They seek every great office, yet they believe in so very little. Only UKIP can change this. Only UKIP can shake up that cosy little clique called Westminster. I'm joining UKIP not because I'm a Conservative who hankers after the past. I want change. Things can be better than this. I'm an optimist. Britain's a much better place than it was when I was born in the early 70s. We're more open and tolerant. We are, for the most part, more prosperous. More people are free to grow up and live the lives they want to lead than ever before. The internet is making everyone a participant. It's giving the governed the same information as the governing. As the father of a young daughter, I've come to appreciate all that feminism has achieved. Both boys and girls are growing up in Britain today having better life chances than before, thanks to that greater equality. There's been a revolution in attitudes towards disabled people. What was once dismissed as political correctness gone mad, we now recognise as just straightforward good manners. Good. So much about Britain is so much better, except when it comes to how we do politics. UKIP is not an angry backlash against the modern world. Modernity has raised our expectations of how things could be. We need change. People have a right to expect a government that gets the basics right. In a world of 24-hour supermarkets and instant access everything, it ought to be possible to make an appointment to see a GP. Yet in my Essex constituency, older folk are literally left standing in line and waiting on pavements. They have to compete to be seen by a doctor. People have a right to expect a government that controls who crosses our borders. Tens of thousands of Londoners log in and log out of the London Underground system every day. Yet the government has just wasted another £224 million on a system that failed to log people in and out when they cross our borders. Ministers promised us real bank reform. They only tinkered so things could stay the same. They don't think things through. They make one glib announcement after another. Then they move on to the next speech, the next headline, the next announcement. They promise to cut public debt. In just 5 years of this government, public debt will have increased by more than it did under 13 years of Gordon Brown. Clever wordplay about debt and deficit can't possibly hide the fact that the government is still having to borrow £100 billion a year. And even then, they're not getting the basics right. We need change. People have a right to expect a government that is answerable to Parliament and a Parliament that is meaningfully accountable to the people. All three parties went into the last election promising to give local people a right to recall their MP. The coalition agreement promised a system of open primaries to throw politics open to those beyond SW1. Of course, none of it's happened. The Whip spent the summer trying to undermine Zac Goldsmith's excellent proposals for recall. They're not serious about real change. It's above all this failure to deliver on the promise of meaningful political reform that has driven me to this podium here today. We need change in our relationship with Europe. When we joined what was to become the European Union all those years ago, we imagined we would be joining a prosperous trading bloc. It accounted for some 40%, 36% of world output. Today it accounts for less than 25%. In a decade, it's expected to account for less than 15%. Europe's the one continent on the planet that's not growing. Even a decade ago, we were told that we had to join the euro because it would bring prosperity. Looking across the channel, no one seriously argues that anymore. Yet who in Westminster, who amongst our so-called leaders, is prepared to envisage real change? To be fair, over the past 4 years, ministers have, on occasions, done the right thing about Europe. They vetoed a treaty change, they refused a budget increase, and of course they eventually agreed to an in-out referendum. But on each occasion, they only did the right thing because they were forced to by their own side. On each occasion, they instructed their own MPs on a 3-line whip to do the wrong thing. No one cheered David Cameron's Bloomberg speech more loudly than me when he promised to negotiate a fundamentally different relationship with the EU, when he promised to put it to the people in 2017, in or out. But there's been no detail since. That's because there isn't any. They're not serious about it. They haven't thought it through. The Prime Minister specifically ruled out associate trade-only relationship with Europe at a meeting this June to the 1922 committee. His advisers have made it clear that they won't contemplate a deal with UKIP. They're more comfortable doing deals with Nick Clegg than with a party that wants real change in our relations with the EU. His advisers have made it clear that they're looking to cut a deal that gives them just enough to persuade enough voters to vote to stay in. That's the game plan. It's not about giving real change to our national interest. It's about not changing things. It's about hanging on to office. Once I realised that, my position in the Conservative Party became untenable. There is a world of change and opportunity out there. Tens of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in recent decades. There's a growing middle class in India, in China, and elsewhere. Our future prosperity rests on being able to produce things that those new consumers want. Ministers are simply not up to giving us the kind of realignment that we need. It's not enough that I leave the Conservative Party and join UKIP. As someone who's always answered directly to the independent-minded people of Essex, there's only one honourable thing for me to do. I must seek permission from my boss, the people of Clacton. I will now resign from Parliament and stand for UKIP in the by-election that must now follow. I don't have to do this. It would have been easy for me to muddle along comfortably as a backbench MP. There are all too many who enjoy that convenient lifestyle. That's not the sort of person that I am. I stood for Parliament in the first place because I believe in certain things. I still do, with greater determination than ever. I just happen to know that principle in politics is more important than the career of an individual MP, even when that MP happens to be me. Things don't have to be this way. I'll be asking voters in Essex to help me to change them. Let's do this together. Let's see if we can make history. Thank you. I must now return to Clacton for what is to come. I've just written to every member of my local association, and it's many more letters than it would have been a couple of years ago because it's a thriving association with membership rising. Look, there are many, many good people in my association, and I've wrestled with this. It's been an incredibly difficult decision, and I feel really quite sad at times when I think about it. But I think many of them will come with me. Not all, but many of them will come with me. And I think I need to recognise that although I've always been accountable to party members in my constituency, I'm fundamentally accountable to the voters. They must come first. And so I put myself before the voters and I say, it's your choice. I'm standing here precisely because I know that neither side wants real change. Ed Miliband's been honest enough to say he doesn't want real change. The Conservative leadership is not serious about change. And let me explain a little bit about why. David Cameron told the meeting of the 1922 that there would be no attempt at associate membership, no attempt at a trade-only relationship with Europe. In fact, he's not even looking for new rules that would apply exclusively to Britain as Britain. He's talking about wider changes that would apply to all member states. His advisors have said to me, and I'm not going to breach confidences, but his advisors have said to me that people will not vote to leave. Why? Because we will give them just enough to persuade enough of them to vote to stay in. That is the game plan. This is about not leaving the European Union. If things were moving my way, if I genuinely believed that the Tory party leadership was moving my way on this, I would not be here. David Cameron has made up his mind. He wants to stay in. It's all about positioning for the election. I want fundamental change in British politics. I think we've had a duopoly for many decades, and look at how the country's been run. It's been a competition between cliques to sit on a sofa and to make a decision. It's no way to run politics. It's no way to run a country. I think we need choice and competition in politics. We need fundamental change in the political system. Look at the number of people who no longer bother voting. We need change. Well, I would urge you, if you haven't already, to talk to Matt Goodwin or Rob Ford, who've written a fantastic book. A lot of the data there shows that actually, for example, unlike previous third parties, actually there are many factors, long-term factors in UKIP's favour. Its support is concentrated. There are all sorts of reasons, good, hard, analytical, factual, empirical reasons why I think we can be optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, Douglas has joined a growing political force, not a pressure group, and it's a growing political force that is picking up its support from across the political spectrum. That's the other significant change that we've seen from the early years.
Yeah. One thing I think is very different about UKIP. UKIP is a party that is not treated as the private property of a small privileged clique in Westminster. All the other parties are run by this little clique. You know, they became MPs by working in the offices of MPs, and they tend to run their parties as their own private property. And I think UKIP is a mass membership organisation that's property of all of its members, and that's refreshing. That's what we need.
Well, it's obviously deeply regrettable when things happen like this, when people behave in this way, but it's also, in my view, counterproductive. If you want a referendum on Britain's future in the EU, whether we should stay or go, the only way to get that is to have a Conservative government after the next election.
This must be one of the most closely guarded secrets at Westminster. This morning when we arrived for this news conference, even the UKIP press officers didn't know what was about to happen. But we've certainly had a lot of drama in the last few minutes. Douglas Carswell joins us now live. Mr. Carswell, what happens next for you?
Well, I'm going up to Clacton this afternoon, and I'm going to start talking to my constituents, explaining to them and asking them to make this change with me. Let's do this together.
So you're going to trigger a by-election. So that means you won't be a UKIP MP for very long before there's a by-election.
I could have, and I thought about this, I could have announced this last week and continued to sit on the green benches, but that just felt wrong. I think that if you're going to make a change like this, you need to be honest and honourable, and you need to go back to your constituents and ask their permission. I need permission from voters in Clacton. So I think it's only right and proper that I stop sitting in the House of Commons. I resign as an MP. I will be doing that formally today. And I think it's right and proper that I then put myself forward as the UKIP candidate, and I trust the people. It's up to them to decide if this is the right choice. I'm seeking their permission. Throughout recent years, there have been all sorts of MPs who've moved from one party to another. They've always found an excuse not to actually open themselves up to a by-election. I think that would be dishonourable. I think the only honourable thing for me to do is to say to the people that I represent in Parliament, it's your choice.
You were an early supporter of David Cameron to be the Conservative leader. How do you think he's going to feel now that you've walked out on him?
Don't get me wrong, I've got a lot of time for David Cameron. I happen to like him. I think he's a nice person. I'm not expecting him to send me Christmas cards anymore, but I think he's a decent person. I just don't think he's serious. He's just not serious about the change this country needs. He understands at one level the sort of political reform we need. It was all there in the Conservative Party manifesto. It was all there in the coalition agreement. They've just not made it happen.
So is this about the Conservative Party, or is this about coalition? Would you be feeling the same way if the Conservatives weren't in coalition with the Liberal Democrats?
Who knows what the Conservative government would have done if it had been a majority Conservative government? But I just don't think that's really the reason why they failed to deliver on political reform. I think the reason why they've promised recall and then reneged on it, promised open primaries and then reneged on it, promised to make government accountable to Parliament and Parliament accountable to the people, but not delivered on it. I think it's because actually, ultimately, they're more comfortable being a small clique in Downing Street sitting on the sofa. For them, politics is about people like them. For them, politics is about politicians like them. It's a game between different cliques to get to sit on the sofa. Let's change it. Why don't we have a system of politics where the voter is in charge? They're not serious about real change in Europe. Everything that they're doing is done in order to try to make sure that we, or they rather now, win the general election. They're not serious about changing our relationship with Europe. In fact, advisors to the Prime Minister have said to me, people in this country will not vote to leave. Why? Because they will give people just enough to persuade people at any one given moment in time to vote to stay in. In other words, this is about change so that everything can stay the same. They're not interested in real change.
It's a regrettable thing, and it's a totally counterproductive thing to do, of course, because the only chance of real change in Europe, the only chance of having a referendum where people can decide to stay in the EU or leave the EU, is having a Conservative government, a majority Conservative government at the general election next year. Anything that makes that more difficult damages the chances of change in Europe or the people of this country having their say. So I think it's a totally counterproductive thing to do, and the Conservative Party will go on making the case for that real change and for a referendum, and only we can deliver a referendum.
Are there any more Tory MPs you've got up your sleeve waiting to defect?
Well, yeah, of course, I'm delighted that Douglas Carswell has joined us. He's been a very clear and principled politician ever since he went into Westminster. But I think to not just defect to UKIP, but to be noble enough to say, let's put this to a by-election, is one of the most remarkable things I've seen in my political lifetime. So I take my hat off to him. And I don't think anybody would think that this was the actions of just one person and that nobody else in Westminster feels this way. Of course there are people sitting on the Conservative backbenches, and indeed some on the Labour backbenches, who are so concerned about what's happening to this country. And you only have to see the immigration figures that have come out this morning to know things are hopelessly out of control. Douglas Carswell is one. Who's to say there won't be others?
Well, are there others? You must have been in conversations with other Tory MPs, Eurosceptic MPs, surely.
I'm going to focus today on the fact that our first Member of Parliament in Westminster has defected to us and caused a call for a by-election to justify his decision, and that, I think, is the story of the day. There are others in Westminster having similar thoughts.
Hasn't Douglas Carswell in some ways betrayed his voters? He was voted in as a Conservative MP, and now he's suddenly switched to UKIP, to an entirely different political party.
Well, you could argue that with any defection, and of course over the last few years there have been lots of defections. You know, a lot of Tories went and sat with Labour, and we've seen people moving across the floor. I mean, this is not an uncommon event. What is a very rare event, and I think this is the first time in over 30 years that a Member of Parliament hasn't just defected to another party, but has stood down as a Member of Parliament to say the voters must decide whether I can stay as an MP. That isn't betrayal in any sense at all. That is a very noble and honourable thing to do. And I suspect that across the spectrum, left and right, Eurosceptic and Europhile, a lot of people today will have a great admiration for Douglas Carswell in the way that he's handled this. In the country, a lot of people have left the Conservatives and come to UKIP, as indeed they've left Labour and come to UKIP. Douglas Carswell is the first one to come and join us. He's done it. He's called a by-election, and I think this is a very exciting event.
The UKIP leader Nigel Farage on a walkabout in Clacton this morning, and UKIP is suggesting that, and talking up the chances of a number of other MPs defecting to them, just as Douglas Carswell did yesterday. Let's just listen into this.
The weather's got better already. Got better already.
It had to be done this way. Douglas,
Morning,
good morning.
Nigel.
All right, boy?
Even the weather's got better.
I know. And I'm back in Clacton. The last time I was here was in the European elections of 1999, when Geoffrey Titmuss, who was born and bred and printed on the sea, became one of our first MEPs, and then leader of UKIP. So there's a bit of UKIP history in this constituency, which is great.
Douglas, can I ask you for ITV News, do you still think it was a good idea to quit the Tory party this morning?
Absolutely. The level of support that I've had has been phenomenal. Before I came here,
Well, the two men there, Douglas Carswell and Nigel Farage, taking questions. One national newspaper claiming today that 8 Tory backbenchers have been in talks with UKIP. Let's just listen in again.
To get into number 10.
look, I don't really see the difference between either front bench. That's why I'm doing this. What
So
do
you'd
you
be
think?
quite happy to see Ed Miliband in number 10?
What would be the difference between his gang sitting on the sofas in number 10 or the current gang? It's because we've been run that way that I think we need change. That's why I'm doing this.
So why were you tweeting in favour of David Cameron, saying he was the only man to back if you wanted a referendum? just a few weeks ago?
Well, because in June this year, he told me and he told the rest of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that he wasn't serious about real change. I changed my mind because the facts changed. What do you do?
But you did tweet in his support very, very recently. Is there something that he said to you that made you feel that he had betrayed you?
He said he was going to rule out real change in our relationship with the EU. Advisors that work for him told me that their plan was to make sure people voted to stay in by getting a deal that persuades just enough people to vote to stay in. Once I realised that, my position became untenable. Before I knew that, obviously, I thought that the in-out strategy was right, but when I realised that it was all about winning the next election, not about real change, I thought enough's enough.
How many of your colleagues do you think will follow you?
Oh, let's wait and see. What I'm really interested in is what people in Clacton think, and I've had really good support on the way here. The reason I was a little late is actually I had quite a few people stopping me in the street and saying, in fact, I had one woman who said she doesn't normally vote, but she's going to vote for me this time. So that's just the sort of thing that I want to hear, and I'm here for my constituents.
How confident are you that you aren't just going to be a lone voice, that no one else will follow you?
I could lose. There's a risk in this. But, I'm putting my principles on the table and I'm saying to people in Clacton, this is what I stand for. Do you want to be represented by someone who answers to you and calls you boss, or do you want to be represented by someone who calls Ed Miliband or David Cameron boss? That's the choice.
Tory splits, though, notoriously they've been bad for you at elections in the past. You're quite happy to see party damage.
Define you.
You're quite happy to see the party damaged and helping Labour.
I'm in UKIP now. I believe that this country needs fundamental change. We've been governed by the same little cliques for too long. The same sorts of people who became MPs by working in the offices of MPs. It's time for change. It's time for a party
how will you get fundamental change with just perhaps one MP
ask the voters. Put up candidates from a party that belongs to its members, not to a small clique in Westminster.
If you are a genuine Eurosceptic, and by that I mean you don't want to be a member of a political union with Europe, where most of our laws are made, and that gives us open borders, that gave us those shocking immigration figures that came out yesterday, which are bound to get worse, given where the Eurozone is. There is only one party for a true Eurosceptic, that is UKIP. But I think what Douglas has done, let's see what happens in this by-election. But if Douglas wins this by-election, which I believe he will, there'll be others, not just on the Conservative, but on the Labour backbenches too, who'll think, do you know what, UKIP may well be for me. Douglas and I started talking seriously about this in June, after you'd been to that meeting, when you realised that, frankly, the whole thing was a sham.
So Ed Miliband will deliver a referendum then?
I would be very surprised if, come the general election, the Labour Party weren't promising a referendum too. At all the last general elections, they all promise a referendum, but none of them ever actually mean it.
They're not promising it now. Only David Cameron's promising it now.
And why did he promise that? Why did he promise that? In 2012, on 5 separate occasions, David Cameron said, I do not want there to be an in-out referendum. It is not in the interests of this country. And indeed, he 3-line whipped people like Douglas to vote against a referendum. I'm pleased to say that you broke the whip, as of course you've done on many occasions.
And then he made it the flagship of his European election campaign.
And then he turns around. Because he sees pressure coming from UKIP. There's nothing sincere in what Cameron's doing at all. Clegg will match the pledge. They do it at every election. They don't mean it. If we want real change, we've got to get UKIP into the House of Commons in real numbers.
I'm going to quit my job, I'm going to get off the green benches, and I'm going to put my faith in you, the people. I've always advocated localism and direct democracy. I'm practicing what I preach.
Quite right.
So you don't think there's any chance that you might change your mind again once you realise that UKIP are perhaps only going to get a handful of MPs? You might go back to the Conservative fold. Why should people believe you're here for good if you weren't in the Conservative Party?
I answer to local people. They're my boss. I think I couldn't, in all honesty, answer to them and remain in the Conservative fold because I want serious change. I couldn't bear to spend the next 8 or 9 months pretending that the people at the top of the Conservative Party were prepared to give real change.